what I'll give you is a quick overview of how I've been involved with eresearch, as it's now called. Not when I started, it certainly wasn't called that. In a rather rapid way, lots of shorthand, and anybody who wants to follow up individual things can do so. And I'll keep an eye upon Bill's brief of creativity and quality. It might just be worth saying how the kind of visual analysis I'm concerned with on computer, and I'm not a data person, I'm not predominantly interested in inquiring of databases, visual or otherwise. I'm interested in how computer graphics and the visual potential of a computer can interact with my subject, which is images. It might be just worth saying what this might have a relationship with in the various sciences, which most of you are concerned with. In the regular column I've been writing in Nature since 1999, I've often taken on board images from science and subjected them to the kind of visual analysis that you would subject a work of art to. And I think, although you're probably mainly concerned with big data sets, I have to say that generally in science, the awareness and literacy of what a given visual image delivers and doesn't deliver is not very high. This is probably not true at the top end of science, but I would say the average foot soldier of science simply accepts the visual tools of presentation without any serious scrutiny as to what they do and can't do. And I think if a visual historian like myself, as a historian of visual images, has anything to bring into this broader area, it is at least that of getting people to ask questions, and questions even about how the visual image alters or constricts the conceptual field which people can think of working in. Anyway, that's a rather a big issue to throw out, but we might like to think of it in due course. I'll treat what I've done more or less in chronological sequence. The first was 1989, a Leonardo exhibition at the Hayward Gallery in London, when I collaborated with the IBM Research Centre in Winchester and basically tried to get computers to work with Leonardo's ideas base, not so much with the finished image, but with his notion of various things. We looked at optics, we looked at three-dimensional geometry, we looked at the design of churches, perspective and branching systems, and in a sense were scratching itches that Leonardo couldn't scratch with still images. So it was a very particular endeavour, and I have to say all this stuff I'm doing is absolutely not typical of the field. It's not typical of art history at all that most people are not doing this kind of thing with visual images, which seems to me to be a great shame because we've got a terrifically potent visual tool, both for exposition and for analysis at our hands. Most art history is concerned with heavy-duty storage of images, inquiring of databases about subject matter and various things. The ability so far of computer vision to analyze images with anything like even the rudimentary sophistication that you might need is very limited, but I think that will come. Anyway, the Hayward Gallery, I can't show you much of this, and one of the problems with these historical things, this is 1989, is recovering them and actually getting them to run in modern equipment. And there's an interesting question here about how the history of science, or the history of any enterprise, or the history of, say, computer graphics in art history, will be taught or will be examined or researched when the data is simply inaccessible, as it won't run. And for a historian, there's a serious question here. You are all becoming history minute by minute, and in computer science, faster than most of us. But how will we find out what you've been doing? There's a real problem here. You know, you may be only interested in the latest thing, but as a historian, I find this terrifying. You know, Darwin, we've got 30,000 letters, which tells us a lot about Darwin. Where's your stuff? It's disappearing, isn't it? Anyway, that's again a sort of a sideways thought. I'll just show you, and I hope this will run. It's old stuff here. This is about the only one I've been able to recover quickly enough to show you here. If I move away from the mic, I shall be scolded. And we used ray tracing to look at the way in which Leonardo was analysing light and shade on objects. Quite simple propositions, but for Leonardo these simple propositions were essential if you were to paint a head, if you were to paint anything. And this one is about sheen. It's about the relationship between ordinary light on a form and the light on a shiny form. In Latin terms is the difference between lux, lumen and splendor, with an Italian equivalence. This particular one is a simple demonstration that the occlusion of an object by the eye on a background is the same as the dimensions of the car shadow if we take this as a point source of light. It gives you the sort of thing we were doing. This was ray tracing, and Leonardo, of course, is doing ray tracing in his diagrams, and it struck me as being fun. I'll stop it at that point. To get these two things, modern ray tracing, this is 1989, modern ray tracing as it was then, and Leonardo's notions of the passage of light and the impact of light upon forms to talk to each other. The second enterprise, not too long after that, was 1996-7, I think, when I did a CD-ROM for Bill Gates on the Leicester Codex, the codex which he bought after Armand Hammer had totally mismanaged his bequest to his museum in Los Angeles. And we did a very elaborate system of accessing Leonardo's knowledge. And I won't explain all the details of that. On the left is my initial sketch, which I did for the system, which was a tree system of access to Leonardo's knowledge with fundamental principles like mathematics down in the root, some core microcosmic life and four-element systems, and then all the expression in the various ends. When I showed the computer people who said that, they've done the job, you've done the job for us. But it's one of the things I'm also interested in is where the handmade thing still has a role. And I couldn't do that by computer. It simply wouldn't respond fast enough or messily enough. And the inherent messiness of the hand-done thing is incredibly important in the creative field. If you talk to somebody, I'm talking to Philip Pullman at the moment about doing a TV program called The Hand Bites Back. And this is absolutely not as I'm a Luddite, as you can see, but I'm very interested in the physicality and the interchange of the physical mark we make and the whole imaginative conceptual structure. We did all sorts of amazing things, and I can't demonstrate this. The upper right bit there is something we called a codoscope, which you could move down over the manuscript, and it would flip Leonardo's original text, which is written in mirror writing. It would transcribe it into Italian, and it could translate it. And you could choose any of these windows, or you could actually do that with the background as well. That, if I could run it readily, would be the most wonderful tool for teaching my research students to read Leonardo. But I can't run it at the moment, so I can't use it. And I'll just give you some idea. I've managed to pillage two of the animations just to give you some idea of the sorts of things we were doing. The first one is concerned with this image here, which is Leonardo's very precocious image historically of the lumen cenereum, the ashen light reflected, as he correctly deduced, from the Earth onto the shaded side of the moon, a discovery I think normally credited to Galileo. Anyway, you can see the diagram there and above it, and you can see this diagram here. And people in humanities are not very quick to pick up these sorts of diagrammatic things. So if you animate them, people suddenly go, ah! Let's see if this will run. Yes, it does. Quite simple. But... And this is a CD, so somebody at home can run it and look at it with the text and get a sense of what's going on. The second one is a animation of this very tiny marginal sketch in which Leonardo is looking at why this house here is threatened by the meander of the river and how you can do anything about that. And he says the best way is not to shore up the bank, but to manipulate the stream of the river. And the reverse current deposits soil where the or deposits material, silt, at the point which had previously been eroded. These are public demonstration things, but I should say that when you're putting this sort of thing up using very precise media, which you're asking very precise questions, your research has to be more precise than it would often be in humanities. That just the sheer precision of the graphics does mean that you have to get things either right or wrong, but you have to get precision out of them. So there is an element even in these sort of educational tools that we're doing here of seeing the research to levels of real exactness before you can put them in. If you put in rubbish, of course, you get completely the wrong sort of thing happening. The second area is pictorial space, which has been one of my continuing concerns, the optical geometry in art. Here, one of the great war horses, and I'm going to be looking at two of the great war horses for perspectival analysis. There's Masaccio's Trinity of about 1426, Santa Maria Novella in Florence, one of the most analysed pictures of all time. I sometimes feel we should have a 5-10 year moratorium on discussing certain pictures and come back to them with a fresh look. I'd spent time, this is oddly enough from an Italian edition of my book, The Science of Art, I'd spent time doing the normal kinds of things, drawing lines on reproductions. I use as big a reproductions as I can. I use drafting instruments, and I use draftsman's film, which is dimensionally stable to a greater degree than paper. But obviously it's only as good as the extraction of the data is. It's only as good as your lines. You can put this into a CAD program and you can do all sorts of fly-throughs, but again, it's only as good as the initial line is. What I learnt here was that in the robotics group in engineering and computer vision, a young Italian, Antonio Cremonesi, had a system which I'd been looking for years of reversing computer-aided design, as it were, going from the image to the 3D structure. Called single-view metrology. He was doing it, I think, largely with forensic use in mind, crime scenes analysis, where you have no data on the camera, but getting metrical data out of it. Anyway, single-view metrology. And basically, he goes from the image with one assumption. You have to assume one object is a certain shape, a square or some regular object, and then basically the analysis is done without other visual data being openly extracted by hand or any other means. In this case, you can have two assumptions. You can assume that the ground plan of the chapel in which these figures are standing, the Virgin, St. John, God the Father and Christ standing on this tomb-like object, you can assume that that is square, in which case the coffers come out as rectangular. If you assume the coffers are square, the square bits in the vault, then the ground plan comes out rectangular. So you've got two alternatives there, both reasonable assumptions. I won't go into why this is an interesting historical problem, other than to say whatever choice you make there alters radically how you think Masaccio made this picture, and it is the first fully coherent perspective picture we know. There's some in classical antiquity, but none of the surviving ones match up to this. So the stakes in terms of the history of visual images are quite big. And this is a fly-through, which Antonio did. The quality is for demonstration purposes only. If we wanted to kit it up for public display, we'd obviously do a lot of rendering. We would put the figures in 3D and so on. But it just gives you an idea of this is the square ground plan assumption, which I think is the right one to begin with, but I won't go into that. And the second one is, again, the second big war horse, analysed and analysed and analysed by various people, including myself, the period della Francesca Flagellation from, say, 1465, 70, something of that kind of date. This very peculiar picture with the main subject of the flagellation set in this small area of the background. I'd done a hand analysis of this using a full-scale reproduction. In this case, the picture is 58.3 centimetres long, exactly an Italian braccia, and that's what I came up with. And interestingly, the diagonal of this is the same length there, so it's a root 2 system. It's incommensurable. Antonio looked at this, and although this is not as high resolution as one would like, he found that the tile pattern there, which I couldn't do by hand, because it was simply too tight, actually comes out perfectly as well. So Piero was better than I was, which is no surprise. Again, we can ask very specific questions about it. We can ask questions about the relative sizes of the figures given the norm of a figure size in this. And it tells us that, reasonably speaking, that Piero obviously calculated the height of his figures in relation to the dimensions of the floor, but did a certain amount of adjusting to make the heads come out in effective positions. Artists always manipulate these things to get the pictorial effect right. And another, just to give you an idea, another fly-through, once again for demonstration purposes and not for the sake of visual quality in this case. The tile pattern outside is based upon regular arithmetical divisions. The tile pattern inside is based upon root 2 incommensurable ratios, which is kind of cute and quite deliberate. Then with Antonio Cremonesi, he's now working in Microsoft Cambridge, which is slightly inconvenient, not least because he's given so much work to do by Microsoft Cambridge, he's got no time to play around with the works of art. This is something I suggested he might look at, because the computer vision people were beginning to work on reflections on curved surfaces, which is a non-trivial problem in terms of deprojecting them. And in this case, a mirror, we didn't know the bulginess of it. This is in Prado, Madrid. It's Robert Compin. It's one wing of a triptych of which the central panel is lost, done for this man, Canon van der Werle, who is kneeling with St. John the Baptist. Anyway, we looked at these mirrors, which are sort of classic things in Netherlandish painting. Some of you may know the Jan van Eyck Arnolfini wedding, which is perhaps the most famous of them. And they are spectacularly, beautifully and painted, and there's a lot of visual data there about the room. And when you deproject the mirror, and I won't go into, we tested various things like parabolic mirrors, which was more theoretical, but anyway, I won't go into that. The mirror deprojects to a degree which is uncanny, and to some extent the scaling is actually better than in the picture itself. And you can even see at one point the door here, this bit of drapery is coming out from behind this open door. What this says to me is that this picture can only be done with a real tableau. If you set yourself the task of putting a plain mirror on the end wall of a room and then imagining there are objects in the way, and I tell you work out the occlusions, it's hard going. You can do it with the paper, you can do it plan, elevation, but it's long-winded. But if I ask you to do it on a circular mirror, forget it. So what this tells me, and it's rather a radical conclusion in terms of Netherlandish art, is that the artist actually had a setup like this which he portrayed. Netherlandish people don't much like this because it's kind of old-fashioned. You know, this business, you look hard at something and portray it, but I think it's inescapable that they, and in the Arnolfini wedding and some other Netherlandish pictures with mirrors, that the artist must have actually looked at the mirror with this scene, because you won't get all these occlusions. You also will end up, if you do it by eye and just thinking about it, lots of incompatible curves, and they won't deproject accurately. And finally, a very extraordinary story in a way. This is the latest one, and this is going to be state of the art of animations. You'll be happy to hear after these rather ragged things we saw earlier. For the Leonardo exhibition 2 years ago at the Victoria and Albert Museum, I worked with an animator called Steve Meyer, then of Cosgrove Hall, now of Impossible Pictures, to animate a series of Leonardo drawings which are otherwise very difficult for people to come to terms with. The prime aim was the aha factor, where people presented with these difficult drawings actually can say, aha, you know, I can see what's going on here. But there's also a sense that these animations work very profoundly with Leonardo's thought patterns. I won't go into that, but you might just take it. And we were looking at one of these three cusp valves in two of the aortas. Three of the aortas have them. One has the mitral valve is a two cusp valve. Anyway, here is the valve in isolation here, showing how it works with these three cusps. And it's passive in action, as Leonardo was the first to note. And he decided that the valves, by the way, it's an ox heart, not a human heart. The valves, you could understand how they worked if you transferred what he knew about water motion as a hydraulic engineer, and he did work as an engineer of rivers, into the valve of the heart, and you transferred the knowledge of vortex action into that. So it's a wonderful thing of lateral transfer in this case. Anyway, when we were looking at this, I was in contact with two people who were looking at the problem from different points of view. The first one was Francis Wells, who's a heart surgeon at Papworth. And interestingly, the heart surgeons traditionally have looked a lot at the flesh and blood valves, and not very much at the hemodynamics, the actual motions inside the valve. And they weren't much interested in theoretical modelling, most surgeons. It's absolutely not their bag. They're hands-on flesh and blood people in a literal sense. Anyway, Francis Wells was interested in this question of vortex imaging, which is now a big deal in heart research. It wasn't at one time. It's now become one of, with Dennis Noble, who is mentioned, the spectacular modelling of movement in the heart, the movement of the water in the heart. And the second one was a professor of aeronautical and biological engineering at Caltech called Maury Garib, and he was independently looking at the heart and talking of building Leonardo's model. And Leonardo, in the top left-hand drawing there, says, make this model in glass, i.e. the neck of the aorta, put in millet seed and see what happens. A wonderful little bit of theoretical modelling. Anyway, Maury made the valve, made the neck of the aorta. We tested it, and it produced wonderful vortices looking uncannily like Leonardo. And he then put in the, as you can see there in the bottom left slide, looking down from the top of his device, he put in the membranes. And on the right, this is actually pre-membrane, but you can see the analysis of the vortices you're getting. And the point of the vortices is they snap the valve closed. They fill the valve. So it pumps, goes through the neck of the aorta, compresses it, the vortices come back, fill the valves, the valve is shut, then pump again. It's an absolutely fantastic mechanism. Anyway, I put these two people in touch with each other, Maury Garib. They've already had two publications together, and Francis Wells has rewritten one of his valve operations, which is patients now called the Leonardo operation. So if you're wanting a bit of creativity out of this, I think you couldn't have a better example. It's not my creativity, but it's what happens when you get people together. Or let me go back just a bit, and I'll introduce this. And this is the animation that we did for. This is the animation which we did for the Leonardo show, and we had what 8, 9, and 10 animations. Can't count now anyway. But this embeds data from Francis Wells. This is the heart, and the heart acts like a wrung-out towel. It's spiral. That's where the force of the heart comes from. It doesn't do that. It rings like a towel. Keep an eye on these little fellows. You can imagine how many lines of label in an exhibition you'd need to do this. Anyway, pretty stuff, thank you.